Margaret Elaine Hobbs told herself it would only be one night. That was 14 months ago. She was 53 years old, and she was sleeping on a wooden bench along the Thames embankment in London, with a canvas bag tucked beneath her head and a thin grey coat pulled tight across her shoulders. The river moved quietly in the dark beside her, and the city carried on as it always did, loud, indifferent, and full of people who had somewhere to be. Margaret had once been one of those people. She had owned a small terraced house in Peckham. She had grown tomatoes in the back garden every summer and kept the front steps scrubbed clean every Saturday morning. For 26 years, she had packed her husband Gerald's lunch, ironed his work shirts, and sat across from him at the kitchen table each evening while the news played on the television. It had not been a glamorous life, but it had been hers, and she had loved it with the quiet, steady kind of love that does not need to announce itself. Gerald died in the autumn of 1985, a heart attack, sudden and without warning, on a Tuesday afternoon at work. The grief was terrible, but Margaret had prepared herself for grief. She was a practical woman, and she knew that losing a husband of 26 years would break something inside her. What she had not prepared for were the letters that arrived 3 weeks after the funeral. Letters from the bank. Letters about a mortgage that Gerald had secretly borrowed against. Letters about debts she had never known existed. Gambling debts, mostly. Small amounts that had grown quietly into a large and suffocating number over many years. By the spring of 1986, the bank had taken the house. Her 2 sons were living abroad by then. She wrote to them both. One replied once, briefly, with sympathy, but without an invitation. The other did not reply at all. Margaret did not blame them. She had raised them to stand on their own feet, and she supposed they had simply taken the lesson too thoroughly. By the autumn of 1986, she was on the street. She found a small group of rough sleepers near Waterloo Bridge, 4 of them, younger than her, each carrying their own quiet story. They did not ask too many questions of each other, which Margaret appreciated. She became, without anyone deciding it, a kind of steady presence among them. The youngest was a 22-year-old boy named Danny, who had the wide, startled eyes of someone who still could not quite believe where life had brought him. Margaret kept an eye on Danny the way she had kept an eye on her own sons, not intrusively, just watchfully. She was not bitter about her circumstances. People who encountered her always remarked on this later. Her eyes carried a kind of calm steadiness, as though she were simply waiting for the next reasonable thing to happen and was prepared to manage it when it did. The night that changed everything was February the 3rd, 1988. The temperature had dropped to 4 degrees below zero. Margaret and the others had found partial shelter beneath a wide stone arch near Waterloo Bridge. Not warm exactly, but out of the wind, which on a night like that made all the difference. She had eaten a bread roll from a church kitchen earlier that evening and drunk 2 cups of weak soup. She had settled herself against the wall, pulled her coat close, and was beginning to drift toward sleep when she heard it. It was not a loud sound. It was the kind of sound that most people would have slept through. A low, murmuring groan, barely above silence, coming from the far end of the arch where no one usually slept. Margaret opened her eyes. She lay still for a moment, listening. The sound came again. She took the small torch she always kept in her coat pocket, a battered thing with a cracked casing that still worked, and walked toward the sound. He was lying on his side at the far end of the arch, half hidden behind a low concrete ledge, an old man, clearly far older than the others who slept in that space. He was wearing a wool overcoat that had once been very fine. She could see that even in the dim torchlight, but it was soaked through at the collar and wet around the sleeves. His face was pale, almost gray, and his breathing was shallow and uneven, with a faint rattling sound at the end of each exhale. Margaret knew that sound. She had heard it in Gerald's final days. She knelt down beside him without hesitation. She did not know his name. She did not ask it. There were more important things to attend to first. She moved him gently, speaking to him softly as she did, repositioning him away from the damp section of ground he had been lying on, and into the driest corner of the arch. She took her own blanket, the single dry blanket she had been carefully protecting all winter, and laid it over him. Then she opened her flask, the one that still held the last of the weak tea from the church kitchen, and she coaxed him to drink. It took time. He was barely conscious, but she held the flask to his lips, with the patience of someone who understood that urgency and gentleness are not opposites. And slowly, carefully, he swallowed. His eyes opened once while she was doing this. They were blue, faded to the pale color of winter sky, and they looked at her with the confused, frightened expression of a person who does not know where they are or how they got there. Margaret met his gaze directly. "You're all right," she said. "I've got you. You're not alone." He said one word back to her, in a voice barely above a whisper. "Rosalind." She assumed it was the name of someone he loved. She held his hand and did not let go. Then she turned to Danny, who had woken and was standing nearby watching. "Go and find someone," she said. "A police officer, a night worker, anyone in a uniform. Run." Danny ran. He came back 20 minutes later with a paramedic who had been attending a separate call half a mile away and had agreed to come immediately when Danny described what he had found. The paramedic knelt beside the old man, checked his pulse and his breathing, and made a call on his radio. Within 10 minutes, an ambulance had arrived. Margaret stood back and let them work. She answered the questions they asked her. How long had he been here? Had he spoken? What had she given him to drink? And she answered them clearly and calmly. When they lifted him onto the stretcher, she noticed that the old man's eyes were open again and that he was looking at her as they carried him away. She raised her hand, a small gesture, the way you might wave to someone at a train station. Then the ambulance doors closed, and the lights moved away across the bridge, and Margaret walked back to her corner of the arch, sat down against the wall, and picked up her coat. She did not think of herself as having done anything remarkable. She had done the obvious thing, and now it was done. She did not know the old man's name. His name was Reginald Arthur Cavendish Moore. He was 79 years old. He was a retired civil engineer who had, during a distinguished career in the 1950s and 1960s, played a significant role in building sections of 3 major road systems across the north of England. He had been widowed in 1979. He had walked out of his flat in Knightsbridge 3 days earlier, in a confused state, caused by a severe chest infection and the early stages of a condition affecting his memory, and no one had known where he was. He was also the father of Lord Edmund Cavendish Moore, the 4th Duke of Halsworth. In certain circles of British finance, law, and politics, the name Edmund Cavendish Moore was spoken carefully. He was not a man who appeared in newspaper gossip columns or attended the kind of parties where people smiled for photographs. He was 51 years old, precise in everything he did, and known for a quality of attention that made people feel, when they sat across a table from him, that he had already considered every possible outcome of the conversation and had decided in advance which one he preferred. He was not cruel, but he was formidable in the way that very few people are, not through aggression, but through complete and utter stillness. He had not spoken to his father in 7 years. The details of their disagreement were known only to the two of them, and neither had ever explained it fully to anyone else. What was known was simply that they had stopped speaking, and that the silence between them had hardened slowly into something that neither man knew how to break. When the hospital in Lambeth telephoned the Cavendish Moore estate on the morning of February the 4th to report that a Reginald Cavendish Moore had been admitted the previous night, Edmund was on a train south within the hour. Reginald spent 11 days in hospital. For the first 3, he was too ill to hold a proper conversation. By the 4th day, he was sitting up and asking whether his flat had been properly locked. By the 5th, he was well enough to tell Edmund about the woman. He did not remember much with clarity. His memory of those 3 days outside was patchy and confused. But certain things had stayed with him, the way that vivid details sometimes anchor themselves even in a troubled mind. He remembered her voice, calm, he said, in a way that suggested she was not interested in frightening him. He remembered the warmth of her hand. He remembered the tea, which he described, with a faint smile, as perfectly dreadful and exactly right. She had nothing, Reginald said. He was looking at the ceiling of his hospital room when he said it, not at Edmund. Less than nothing, I imagine, and she gave me everything she had. He turned and looked at his son. Find her, he said. See to her. It was not a request. Edmund recognized his father's tone from childhood. He nodded. His solicitor suggested a private investigator. Edmund declined. Instead, he contacted a woman named Patricia Hale, who worked for a housing charity that operated along the South Bank and knew the rough sleeping community in that area well. He told her only that he was looking for a woman in her 50s who had been sleeping near Waterloo Bridge and who had helped someone the previous week. Then, on 3 consecutive evenings, he went with her to look. He did not bring staff. He did not give his title. He wore a plain dark overcoat and gave his name simply as Edmund. On the 3rd evening, Patricia spoke to a young man near the entrance to the arch, Danny, though Edmund did not learn his surname, who remembered the night clearly and described Margaret with enough detail that Patricia knew immediately who he meant. She knew where Margaret usually spent her days. They found her the following morning, sitting on a bench outside Waterloo Station, eating a bread roll from a paper bag. She had a copy of a newspaper on her lap, a discarded one she had picked up from a waste bin, and she was reading it with the careful, focused attention of someone who considered staying informed a matter of personal responsibility. Edmund sat down beside her. She did not look alarmed. She looked at him the way she appeared to look at most things, steadily, without hurry. "My name is Edmund," he said. "I believe you helped my father, a few weeks ago, near the bridge." Margaret considered this for a moment. "The old man in the arch," she said. "Is he all right?" "He is recovering well," Edmund said. "Good," she said, and she returned to her newspaper. Edmund sat with this for a moment. He was not accustomed to being set aside. He found, to his mild surprise, that he did not mind it. He told her then who he was, not his title at first, but his connection to Reginald, and what his father had said from his hospital bed. He explained that the estate owned a small flat in Bermondsey, self-contained, currently empty, and that he would like her to use it while more permanent arrangements were worked out. There would be no conditions attached, he said. His father had asked him to see to her, and he was seeing to her. Margaret put the newspaper down on her lap. "I'm not interested in charity," she said, "if it comes with the expectation that I'll spend the rest of my life being visibly grateful." Edmund looked at her. Something about the directness of it, the complete absence of either aggression or apology, registered with him in a way he could not entirely have explained. "It doesn't," he said. "My father made a request. I'm fulfilling it. What you choose to do afterward is entirely your own affair." There was a brief silence. "Is the flat clean?" Margaret asked. "It was cleaned yesterday morning," he said. She folded her newspaper, tucked it into her canvas bag, and stood up. "All right then," she said. Margaret moved into the flat in Bermondsey in February of 1988. Within 6 months, she had found part-time work at a community center for elderly residents in Southwark, helping with afternoon activities, and sitting with those who had no visitors. She was particularly good, the coordinator noted, with residents whose memory was failing and who sometimes became frightened. She had a way of speaking to them, calmly, directly, without talking down to them, that seemed to settle people in a way that no formal training could fully teach. She began contributing to the rent the following year. Reginald Cavendish Moore left hospital in late February and spent the remainder of his years between his Knightsbridge flat and a care residence in Surrey. In the spring of 1988, before the fog around his memory thickened too much, he met Margaret once, for tea, at a small cafe near the community center where she worked. He recognized her immediately, stood up from his chair when she walked in, which Margaret later said surprised her more than anything else about the whole business. He held both her hands across the table. "I told Eddie to find you," he said. "He's very thorough," Margaret replied. Reginald laughed. It was the kind of laugh that fills a room without effort. Edmund, who was sitting quietly at a corner table nearby, far enough to give them space, close enough to be present, heard it, and felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for a very long time. He and his father spoke regularly from that point on. The old estrangement, never fully explained, and now no longer necessary, dissolved quietly over the years, the way old grievances sometimes do when life offers something more important to attend to. Reginald died in 1993. Edmund was beside him. Margaret Hobbs continued working at the Southwark Community Center until her retirement in 2001. She was a well-known figure in the local area by then, known for her steadiness, her lack of fuss, and her particular gift with people who were frightened and confused. She did not speak publicly about the night at the Arch, or about the Duke, or about any of it, Except once. In a short interview for a local community newsletter in 1995, which she agreed to only after being assured that it would not be read by anyone of particular importance. She was wrong about that, but she never found out. When asked by the newsletter what had made her stop and help the old man that cold February night, Margaret thought about it for a moment. He needed help, she said, as though the question itself was slightly puzzling. And there was no one else.